Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations with artists, writers, and curators. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 68. Today's guest is Richard Georges. Hey there, folks. Before we get started with today's episode, I wanted to take a minute to mention the Medium Festival of Photography. Now, if you've been listening to the show for a while, you've definitely heard me talk about Medium before, because more than a third of the people I've talked to on this show have been people I either met for the first time at Medium, or I heard about their work at Medium, or they reviewed my portfolio at Medium. And it's that last bit that I wanted to mention. Now, back in episode 60, you heard Brenda Biondo and I talk about portfolio reviews and how valuable they are for photographers. And in episode 44, you heard me talk with Scott B. Davis about the Medium Festival. He's the executive director of the festival. We talked about what it is and why it started. Well, as I'm recording this, there are still several slots available for the portfolio reviews at this year's festival, and I wanted to make sure you all knew about it. If you're a photographer and you want to get your work in front of some great curators, gallerists, and publishers, this is your chance. And to be clear, nobody's paying me to say this. I just really love the festival. And I can honestly say that it has been a huge part of my development as a photographer. In fact, I'm not just recommending it to you. I'm actually already signed up to have my portfolio reviewed this year myself. So if you come to San Diego, not only will you get to show your work to some amazing reviewers, not only will you get a chance to see some fabulous artist lectures and generally have a great time, you'll also get the chance to come say hi to me. And I say this so often, and I'll keep saying it, Medium is my favorite event of the year every year, and I just can't say enough good things about it. So this year's festival is from Thursday, October 18th to Sunday, October 21st. I put a link in the show notes to where you can register for the portfolio reviews, so if you can, come on out to San Diego and get in on this. Okay, so on to today's show. Today's guest is Richard Georges. Richard is a writer, editor, and lecturer in the British Virgin Islands. His poems have been included in numerous journals. He's the author of 2 collections. His debut, Make Us All Islands, which was published by Shearsman Books in 2017. And then most recently, his new collection, Giant, which was published by Platypus Press in February of this year. Richard is the recipient of the 2016 Marvin E. Williams Literary Prize from the Caribbean Writer and has been shortlisted for the Wasafiri New Writing Prize, the Small Axe Literary Prize, the Halik Arvan Prize for Caribbean Literature, and the Forward Prize for Best First Collection. And he is a founding editor of MoCo, a journal of Caribbean arts and letters. Now, I read Richard's book, Giant, recently, and I was immediately drawn to the language and the use of nature imagery, but what made me come back to these poems and really think about them and turn them over in my mind is how, these poems are about a place that I don't know a lot about, the British Virgin Islands, but in talking about things like the aftermath of empire, about myths and legends, about poetry itself, I was really drawn in and able to feel connected and curious too, to the point where I wanted to learn more about some of the context to deepen my understanding of these poems. And I'm always talking about how art is about communication, how it's a thing that gives you a window into other people's experiences. And I think that this is a really great example of work that does exactly that. So I was happy that Richard was willing to talk with me about his work. Now, I put links in the show notes to where you can purchase your own copy of Giant, as well as to MoCo Magazine, which, as I mentioned, Richard is a founding editor of. I do encourage you to check both of those out. As always, if you'd like to join in the conversation, you can use the hashtag ChannelOpenPod to live tweet the episode. And now here's my conversation with Richard Georges. So I was wondering if you wouldn't mind if we could start with a poem?
Sure. Do you have any preferences?
No, it's whatever your choice might be.
Okay. Well, let me pick one that's not too long. I think I will go with Matthew. Okay. Matthew. So we run from house to house, holding hands, and build wooden houses we cannot enter. Light the oil lamps, shut the creaking windows. The howling storm knows our names, exhumes our navel strings. Lord, I can see the inevitable coming, the plodding clouds, the sleeping sea, the earth unmade, the town unmapped. The storm shreds the trees to bones, drags children from their homes by their heels, their voices swallowed whole in the wet night. They divide our lives into bags of rice and dried herring. We are sleeping under the trees, she says, but there are no trees, and you have not eaten in 2 nights.
Thank you. So, one of the things that well, first of all, let me just say that I really enjoyed reading this book, and I've been thinking about it a fair amount since I think I finished reading it the first time a week or so ago, and the thing that really strikes me is how relevant these poems feel to a lot of things about the world right now, and how the conversations that we are having, I think, in a lot of countries like the U.S., and I'm sure in many European countries, about the legacy of colonialism, and how these poems really speak to that. So I guess one of the things that I thought was really interesting was as I was reading through this collection, through the first part of it, I kept thinking about the Shelley poem Ozymandias, and then I turned the page into the second section, and there's the epigraph to that section is from that poem. So this whole idea of sort of aftermath and sort of what comes after seems to really strongly inform a lot of these poems. And I was wondering if we could talk about that a little bit.
Sure. I mean Ozymandias has been one of my favorite poems for, I don't know, probably as long as I've been reading poetry, both because of the immense level of craft on display. And, the first two, let me see. I mean, the first 2 sections in particular are kind of circling, that same issue and speaking more, symbolically and metaphorically about it until it gets a bit more direct in the third section. But I'm not quite sure that, the Ozymandias metaphor works perfectly. I mean, it works visually for me, because it's sort of like, okay, in the Caribbean, you have all of these remains, of the plantocracy and of slavery and indentureship. And I'm sure in most places that have, been colonized or have gone through a period of occupation or the like, will have similar like relics or similar remains of that sort of possession. And I would say, like, so you have like the ruins of great houses and plantations, you have old colonial structures, administration buildings, etc., graves, the ruins of sugar mills, etc., that kind of all speak to this really fraught and troublesome, I guess to put it mildly, past that the whole archipelago excuse me, and the continent really were part of. But I guess the reason why I would say that the metaphor doesn't sit perfectly is that there are these, forgotten spaces like the BVI, like Bermuda, Cayman, Turks and Caicos, Montserrat, with respect to the British Empire. And then you have, Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, American Samoa, etc. You know, in terms of the United States, where they're kind of like these forgotten outposts of empire, of colony that, you know, we don't quite think of in contemporary times as being colonies. But you know, yet and still they are. You know, I mean, and both the United States and the United Kingdom kind of, you know, often speak of, you know, like shared histories or you know, long-standing relationships, you know, euphemisms for possession and subjugation, really. So for that reason, I don't think the Ozymandian metaphor sits perfectly, but it speaks physically to like the remaining symbols of empire in the landscapes, if not the current political and social relationships between these islands and the metropole, if you will.
Yeah. The question of landscape, I mean, landscape figures in many of these poems very strongly. One of the things that I noticed, especially in the first section, that many of the sort of more nature poems have a really markedly different tone from the poems that are sort of more, seem to be more explicitly political. That although obviously, I mean, one can't really talk about land and landscape without talking about politics in some sense, I suppose. But I guess what I mean is that looking back at Ozymandias, that poem is so much about decay and about things falling apart. And so, and many of your poems in this book also have sort of that sense to them, I feel like. Whereas the nature-focused poems seem almost ecstatic, like they have a much more verdant, vibrant feel to them. And I found that really interesting.
And I think that's definitely one of the main themes or the main interests of the work was to look around me for these giant, pardon the use of the word, things, you know, so that these ubiquitous entities that surrounded me in this small space, in this tiny space, there are these quantities that kind of loom large, you know, over you. And one of those things has to be the environment, the nature, the landscape in which we live. I mean, so the main island of the British Virgin Islands is Tortola, which is where I live, and where I've lived most of my life. And it's mainly a rocky mountain range skirted by, you know, beaches and little small areas of flat land. So you're always in view of the sea, but you're also always in view of the mountainside. You know, the mountainside is always above you, and the sea is always beside you. So you sort of can't escape. Not that you would want to, but you can't really miss the landscape, and it sort of imposes itself, and it kind of demands to be seen and to be reckoned with. And the nature of that reckoning, you know, can be destructive on your part, or like I tried to be here, it can be, I guess the word you used was ecstatic, you know, just to have a sense of wonderment about these things that are not overwhelming, but ubiquitous, and that have, you know, I wanted to explore a relationship with that landscape that wasn't rooted in the historical. So that there's a lot of you know, there's a lot of meditation on the fauna, you know, and the flora, and the topography itself, you know, as opposed to trying to relate all the time to some sort of like man-made or some sort of anthropomorphic relationship with it. Sometimes it's just be in awe of it, or, you know, just to honor it. And I think so that was definitely an impetus. You know, while history was also there, one of those giants in the book is history. One of the giants is the book is, like you're saying, the legacy of empire. Another giant there is religion and myth, and storytelling.
Mm.
In the same way, the landscape was one of those giants I had to contend with, and that I had to pay homage to.
Yeah. I mean, it is one of those things that the spaces that we inhabit and that we grow in are they're things that have a really profound impact on who we are as individuals and as communities. One of the things that strikes me about the nature poems is, as you say, they aren't presented really with an eye towards the politics, towards the history, the sort of anthropomorphic history that has happened in those landscapes, but also by having these poems sort of in the same collection next to these other poems, that it really invites a sort of juxtaposition and contrast. And that was one of the things I found very interesting, that, and then also relating that to this idea of religion and myth, how, religion and myth speak very much to beginnings and endings and to eternity. There's a sense I feel in many of these nature poems about sort of this eternal present, I suppose, that's not necessarily as concerned, something bigger than
Right.
what we might be concerned with on a day-to-day basis. And I thought that was a very interesting juxtaposition.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's sort of like what I was reaching for. That despite, like you're saying, like despite the political concerns of the work and my immediate political concerns as a British Virgin Islander, and what it means to be that in this place at this time, there is that dimension. There is that eternal dimension that really doesn't care. That this island inhabits several worlds at once, and that some of those worlds just keep going on. So I mean, to talk about. I mean, this book doesn't speak about Hurricane Irma because it was written before, but the poem Matthew is about Hurricane Matthew striking Haiti, and it's kind of having to sort of live a similar narrative a year later was a bit odd, but the landscape is like the first thing to recover after a disaster of that scale.
Mm.
So while the humanity, that inhabits the place is still reeling physically and psychologically and emotionally and spiritually, you see the hillside that had been stripped bare, that was gray, in 2 weeks begin blooming again, begin flowering, begin greening again. And then you realize that, and you see the birds, you see the fish, you see the beaches remaking themselves, and you kind of realize that the world that we inhabit here is moving on.
Yeah.
That the trauma that we still feel, that the landscape is much more live, much more nimble than we are, and is able to recover, much more dramatically than we can. That it is really these, like I said, these different worlds that are just carrying on. And I think I was trying to capture that with the fleeting lives that I try to look at. I mean, even whether it's goats on the hillside, whether it is, animals that have been, run over on the roadside, or whatever, that there's always this infinite cycle that seems to be going on, despite whatever our hang-ups are. And I guess that kind of is what speaks back to Ozymandias, that whatever we can accomplish, whatever greatness we think that we can achieve, whatever improvements we think that we can make on the world, that time and nature really could care less. It will balance itself with or without us.
Yeah. So you mentioned that mythology and religion are one of the giants in this book, and certainly there are a number of points at which you're making reference to, for example, the Ramayana, or at several points you reference Saint Ursula and that legend. One of the things that I was sort of thinking about, because also many of these poems are about poetry, or at least they, some of the poems, it seems like the whole poem is about poetry, but in other places you are maybe just have a line or two where you're sort of talking about what poetry is, what it does, that kind of thing. And taking those sort of things together, the idea of religion and myth and the idea of poetry, there was something about that comparison that felt kind of profound to me. Like as if maybe poetry is doing some of the same things that...
Yes, it is. Exactly.
Yeah.
Poetry is its own religion. I think, one of the poems makes that comparison very directly. Divination.
Mm-hmm.
Where it says kind of its own religion, its own imprisoned page. The poetry is the poet's way of reckoning, of trying to understand, to kind of feel their way through the world, just to sort of understand it and to understand their place in it. I think mythology and religion are doing the same thing. It's just that poetry tends to be a much more profoundly personal journey, or much more of a solitary journey at first, at least for the poet. I guess it can be communal for the reader, but just the act of writing poetry, is this, for me at least, is a profoundly spiritual experience. It's an act of it's an act of discovery, and not just of the self, but it really is an exploration of where you fit into, where you engage with, or how you interact with and understand life and the world.
Yeah.
That's what it is for me, at least. I've never really been a subscriber to, I don't want to say poetry for poetry's sake, but that's not true. It's just some sort of exercise, to demonstrate linguistic cleverness or something. I think the poetry that is profound, the poetry that compels you to read it, I think is a poetry that is struggling with something that you are also struggling with, which is why you are pulled towards it. Just from me personally, I've never been someone who thinks, okay, well, this is a clever poem. Like for me, if it's a clever poem, then I kind of make a mental note that this is a clever poem, but I don't ever feel like I need to go back to reread it. Once I figure it out, once I figure out the puzzle, if you will, then kind of like and the magic has been lost. But if it's a poem that is really exploring and grappling with, the self, I'm much more compelled to read and reread and to wonder about that work.
Yeah, I feel the same way. It strikes me that one of the things about, you mentioned that it functions as sort of as a spiritual experience in so far as for the poet and for the reader, it can be a way of exploring and sort of understanding the world that you're moving in, which is something that I very, very strongly, like, I agree with that. And I relate to that as a reader and as a writer. One of the things that I was thinking a little bit about is how myth and religion also sort of function as a way of connecting the individual to something bigger, and especially to a tradition, and that's something I feel like is really done pretty explicitly with the references to religion and myth in these poems. Not, that sort of connecting the contemporary moment to sort of an existing legend. But then I was also thinking about how, that through both the epigraphs and then also at a few points throughout the book, you also are making reference to a literary tradition, whether it might be Shakespeare or Shelley or Rimbaud, or there are other ones as well. I thought that and even just insofar as even just the formal elements of some of the poems, like you're working in at some points in sonnets, in villanelles, which are also, these forms are sort of a tradition that's passed down to us from a long time. And that form of connection and community seemed like that there was a resonance there,
Mm. Yeah, and I also try to speak to some of my contemporaries. So the number of poems and that are dedicated to other poets.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
So yeah, so there's tradition as well, but there's also a very intentional gesture towards a community and the poetic community in the region. I think all those things sort of help to root. Not just, myself at least, but I think just help to root the individual. I would admit that the mythologies and traditions that I reference are ones that I have personal connections to, or that are part of my own upbringing between Trinidad and the Virgin Islands. But yeah, I think poetry, there is the history as well. There's a pretty clear chronology, I guess, if you will, from not that there's a finite or a definite beginning point to any of these things, but there is this sense of a lineage that I think just for the intents of this book, just that Caribbean people will feel a part of, or a consequence of, if you will. That these several strands that kind of like weaving their way through history to get us to the point that we are at today. Whether they are from West African traditions or Indian traditions and stories, or even I have in here a lot of not a lot, but there's some Trinidadian folk mythologies as well, Supuyas and Duendes and those kinds of kind of like creolized spirits, if you will. I think they all kind of they've all kind of been woven together, in terms of in my formation or in my personhood, if you will. I guess I'm rambling a bit, but I really do see these several distinct things as sort of kind of like weaving together the person or the individual in this space and in this region. I think we in the Caribbean especially tend to have these multitudes within us. It's sort of difficult to distill them into distinct and homogeneous modes of identity. So you kind of like are at once harkening back to West African tradition. In my personal family background, a West African tradition, East Indian tradition, a European one, and it's not like they're in competition. It's that they're all formative. If that makes sense. So I see these several strands of history, the mythology, the religion, is kind of all weaving together this kind of very textured and layered tapestry. That sort of like helps me at least sort of make sense of who I am in this place. And I think for me, my poetic influences are sort of mirror that. So, I have the formalism that, comes with the colonial English education, that many Caribbean people have received. But then coupled with my explorations into modernism, imagism, and then of course the tradition of Caribbean poetry as well. So it's sort of, I guess, as Walcott would talk about, or Kamal Bradford would talk about, it kind of helps to create something while is at once new is also familiar in these several different ways. I think that's kind of like, it speaks not just to Caribbean poetry or my poetry, but I think it speaks to Caribbean culture as a whole, that there all of these resonances within it from all of these various different parts of the world. But it's kind of created something distinct and new of itself.
It's an interesting thing, you know, like hearing you talk about that. One of the things that I often think about for myself is, you know, so I'm a Japanese American, and my family's been in the United States for, you know, well over 100 years, for many generations now. And then one part of my family is also European. My mother's father was a white man, and so that's something that I think about a lot. It's not the same. I don't mean to suggest that it's the same, that the American context is the same as the Caribbean context, but there's something about what you're saying about many influences coming together and having and being able to draw from many sort of disparate heritages to form something new in terms of identity, and being able to identify with all of those different pieces. This is something that I think about a lot just in my own context, you know, like I have family that goes back to Japan. I have family that goes back to England. So like, you know, because of the way that I look, people might be more inclined to treat me as though the Japanese tradition would be something that would make sense for me to identify with. But why?
So stuff that resonates with you as well. From you can't just sort of divorce yourself from the rest of yourself, right?
Right. And not just also just genetically, but also in the way that, you know, I grew up, you know, so much of what I am and how I think about the world and my place in it is very much informed by the fact that I've spent almost all of my life in California. So,
there you go.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing how that all comes together. Yeah.
I think more and more, I mean, while I would argue that a place like the Caribbean, I mean, to call the Caribbean a place is a bit misleading, because you know, there is no one Caribbean landscape, right?
Right.
But just in terms of, for the purposes of our conversation, you know, to look at the Caribbean as sort of like the great experiment of creolization of the blending of cultures. You know, because we could talk about, you know, many cities as being, you know, cosmopolitan and having multiple groups of people inhabiting it. You know, but you know, when we look at those histories, we tend to see that, you know, like if we take like a New York, you know, or a Miami, for example, you still see a large degree of, even today, of a large degree of segregation between those communities. But like in many Caribbean spaces, like you can look at St. Thomas in the U.S. Virgin Islands, you can look at Trinidad, you can look at St. Vincent, and these island spaces, you know, were just too small to be divvied up into, you know, this is the Irish neighborhood, this is the East Indian neighborhood. You know, you really could not segregate like that. So almost as a byproduct of their smallness, you had, you know, degrees of mixing, both in terms of genetically, but culturally as well, that were just, I think, pretty much unprecedented. You know, so it wasn't so much a question of assimilation into a culture as like I was saying before, like almost the creation of a new one. So in other words, so like East Indian cultures that are based in the Caribbean resonate a lot with East Indian culture or Indian cultures, right? But you know, they are different. They've kind of become something different because of their rubbing against the Afro-Caribbean or the Chinese Caribbean or the you know, the Spanish, the French, the English, etc. You know, you can just go on. The litany is there, and you can just see how these cultures, while maintaining and keeping a lot of their initial culture intact, have kind of turned into slightly different things. You know, so there's I don't know, I think food is an easy example. I mean, I mean, the Trinidadian Indian cuisine is not Indian cuisine, you know. Or, the music out of the Caribbean has, comes from a blending of West African rhythms, with a number of different European forms. And like you see these new things emerging. I mean, that's the interesting thing about it. I think more and more this is becoming, if not the norm, it's becoming much more common across the globe to see these kinds of blends, maybe not on the same scale as it happened during the plantocracy in the Caribbean, but you're still seeing these cultural combinations, in families and in communities that I don't think you saw 50 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of it's an interesting thing where, one of the, I have to admit, like, I'm not that familiar with the, more than just sort of the broad strokes of Caribbean history. One of the things that I'm sort of reminded of in hearing you talk about this is a sort of similar phenomenon in Hawaii, the blending of different Asian and Native Hawaiian and American cultures there, and how that sort of blended together to form sort of a Hawaiian culture that's sort of its own thing now. But
it's like
also,
hybridity,
yeah. But also the thing that you mentioned about the plantocracy, that is, I know that in Hawaii, for example, a lot of those things that are part of the culture now, are also a legacy of a very oppressive system that was in place before, and that people are still dealing with the ramifications of that now. And I have to imagine that it works in a similar way in the Caribbean, to be able to find something that is like, we have this wonderful, unique culture that is all its own thing, but also that it is, and that we can take joy in that, but that also that it always sort of carries with it this sort of echo of, it wouldn't have happened if not for some really awful things that were done.
Right. Yeah. It's definitely a fraught and problematic and violent history. And I don't think that you could argue that, hybrid cultures or creolized cultures come about through any sort of happy meeting between them. There usually is something violent and terrible and exploitative. I think whenever we look at large numbers of people moving into new spaces, that tends to be the tenor of the narrative. I mean, I think we have to on one hand reckon with the history and all its ugly bits, but at the same time, I think appreciating and honoring what is there now that is edifying does not necessarily absolve or ignore of the atrocities that were involved in its creation.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? I think it has to be a very nuanced and a very objective and critical study. When you're looking at spaces like the Caribbean. I mean, that's one of the few places I can talk about with any measure of authority. But I mean, but when you and it is a bloody history from European occupation up until present day, basically in different spheres. But at the same time, I think there is space to observe, record, appreciate how various peoples interacted, how they sort of constructed a way of life for themselves, and many times in spite of the conditions, and to see how those ways of life have either held fast or maybe not held so fast as times have moved on.
Well, There's like a whole bunch of other stuff that I have that I could talk about, but I think why don't we take a little break and we'll come back and do the second segment.
Sounds good.
All right. So for the second segment, I always invite the guest to bring a topic of their own, which can be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever's on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
So I probably want to talk about this sort of distinct and very unique moment in the history of the British Virgin Islands, just because it ties into sort of some of the themes that I was exploring in the book. But now, post Irma, Hurricane Irma, it sort of kind of brought some of those themes that I was circling in the book to the fore. So, and it's at the point where like every citizen of the territory has these things at the forefront of their mind. You know, it's a very uncertain period for us for a number of reasons. I guess I'll just give you some prologue. So last year, August, our annual Emancipation Festival had to get canceled because we had some historic floods take place over the period of the first week in August. Right? So, and it was the worst flooding that we'd experienced in, I think it was like 14 years. Shortly afterwards, the estimates came out that there was about $4 million worth of damage to businesses and properties in the capital, Rotown. And, you know, so people were really trying to recover from that. And that was, like I said, the first week in August. And then on September 6th, Hurricane Irma struck the BVI. And Hurricane Irma was the most powerful storm, in recorded history in the Atlantic, basically. And the devastation was unprecedented. You know, it took out all of our communications. It made many roads impassable, destroyed numerous homes and businesses, many of which are yet to fully recover or be rebuilt. And the damage has been estimated close to £4 billion, which is, I'm not sure of my exchange rate right now.
Yeah.
But it's an astronomical figure.
Yeah.
And to put that into perspective, the BVI, our population prior to Irma was about 35,000 people. And of that 35,000, about 40% are actually BVI Islanders. So we have two main industries, which are tourism and financial services. And they're both dominated by basically skilled and unskilled immigrant labor, or expat labor, depending on your how you feel about use of the word immigrant.
Yeah.
But even the word expat has its own political connotations. You know.
Yeah.
Historically, Europeans, Americans, and Canadians and get to be expatriates, and everybody else gets to be an immigrant. But the territory has been trying to sort of get back on its feet and sort of regain normalcy. And financial services, you know, depending on your perception and where you get your news, you might have a varying perspectives on the financial services industry in the overseas territories. You know, we tend to be vilified as tax havens, but the same scrutiny somehow never falls on the European and North American jurisdictions that offer the same services.
Right.
You know, so for example, the same services are offered in, I think, Delaware, in Las Vegas, in London, in Switzerland, Luxembourg, Liechtenstein. But whenever we're talking about quote unquote tax havens, they're talking about, you know, the Caribbean overseas territories that have these industries, but never the European and North American jurisdictions for some reason.
Well, for some reason.
Yeah, especially when we're talking about the scale of these industries. So which is what I'm going to talk about now. So the BVI's annual revenue in its budget has hovered between 290 and 320 million. So call it $300 million US a year. And of that revenue, financial services has provided about 2/3 of it historically. So it's our main industry in terms of revenue. There are probably more people who work in the tourism industry, but more money comes into financial services. So those are numbers I would like, people to take in consideration. The 35,000 population, right? And $300 million of revenue that we have in our budget, of which financial services is about 200. So, in the global scheme of things, these numbers, that's a tiny population in almost any country. It's smaller than a city, smaller than some neighborhoods. And $300 million in the global scheme of things is not much money.
No.
To have a territory or a jurisdiction to be running on. Right. So then the UK, in the aftermath of Irma, so the British Navy showed up to help with rebuilding efforts and to clear roads, and they brought engineers and really desperate things that were needed. That they came in and they showed up, and we have a British governor, and I think he acquitted himself admirably in terms of the response and the management of the disaster. But there really wasn't much visible concern from the British government directly. I mean, Emmanuel Macron went to St. Martin shortly after the storm. Donald Trump went to Puerto Rico. I mean, and did Trumpian things. But I guess what I'm saying is he showed up. And Rutte, the Dutch Prime Minister, also had a presence. So for all of the territories that were affected by Hurricane Irma, the British Overseas Territories of Anguilla, Turks and Caicos, and the BVI are the ones that were affected. And the British Prime Minister didn't come. She sent her Secretary of State at the time, Priti Patel, and Priti Patel was on our island, on our main island, for less than 12 hours. And then prior to that, she sent Boris Johnson. I'm not sure if you're familiar who Boris Johnson is. He's a bit of a pretty big character in the UK. Not quite Trumpian, but on his way.
Well, and we see a lot of comparisons just because of the hair.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, and he was here for less than 12 hours as well. So that was the extent of the British cabinet's presence, the government's cabinet, and their presence on the ground after the storm. So there really has been a feeling of British apathy towards our situation.
Yeah. It's a strange thing, too, where it's my understanding of the sort of government and political situation of the British Virgin Islands is a little like I just know what I, have been able to gather in the last week or two, but my understanding is that it's sort of not a terribly dissimilar situation, relative to the UK as Puerto Rico and Guam are to the US, where they're not exactly independent, but they're also not exactly like what would be considered a regular part of the full part of the country.
Right.
Sort of.
The poet Craig Santos Perez, he has this collection of poems, or collections, I guess you could say, this trilogy called Unincorporated Territory. He kind of explores that from the perspective of an islander of Guam. So, of not ever being part of the whole, part of the main. And yeah, it's definitely the same sort of foundational relationship, that you will never be part of, that there's this sort of this kind of like limbo political status where you are in control of your own affairs to a particular extent. And then but decisions can be made that affect you directly, and you will just not have any say. You won't even have not just a vote. You won't even have a voice.
Yeah.
When those decisions are being made. I mean, that happened to us with, we sort of kind of like always forgotten. So you had Brexit, and the citizens of the British Overseas Territories are British citizens, but we didn't get to vote. in Brexit, for example. So we are British citizens who don't get to make decisions about our citizenship.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
It's
So
something that, like, since so much of your book has to do with empire and its aftermath, it was something that I was thinking about as I was reading because, in comparison to other British imperial colonies that eventually became completely independent, like India or, I guess even the United States in some ways, like where these countries are not, some places like Canada and India and I guess Jamaica, they're still connected to the UK, but they are their own separate countries. The BVI is in a different political situation. And so that question of empire and aftermath, there are definitely writers in India. There's a long tradition of Indian literature that deals with that exact question, but the context seems very different to me insofar as India is an independent country now,
Yep. I mean, so and even though those three countries remain part of the Commonwealth, they have a very much closed the chapter, if you will, on I guess British leadership or British subjugation or British stewardship, or however you want to frame it.
Right.
I mean, we have not. I mean, and to be frank, there hasn't been historically, any large swelling of support for independence in the BVI. And I think even now, I don't think that there is I don't think there's a very large desire for it immediately. But I think what there is a desire for is for a maturation or a changing of the relationship. So for example, the overseas territories have their own constitutions that have sort of been written with the assistance of the UK, and those constitutions delegate power to an elected government. But the power is delegated. The power really sits with the governor, the British appointed governor, and the power is then delegated from his office to these elected bodies. So, ultimately, and it has happened in the past, the British government, through the governor, can suspend the constitution of one of these territories and implement I don't want to say inflict, but implement direct rule. So you can suspend the constitution, dissolve an elected government, and you can take over the territory. And that has happened in the past. It happened in the Turks and Caicos a few years ago, and actually the Dutch did it very recently in Eustatia. So it's something like that. There's prior precedent, has been set.
And then that really speaks to the whole question of, like if these governments are going to, reserve that kind of power, then what is their responsibility in situations like a huge natural disaster?
Exactly. And that's the question that we're asking now, because, we were essentially told following Irma that, we were too wealthy a territory to receive aid. So, the UK government has spent about 13 million US dollars. But like I told you, the damage has been close to 4 billion pounds. So we've gotten about $13 million US in aid. There's a lot of material aid, about 100 tons of aid, canned goods, tarps to cover roofs, lumber, that kind of thing, for the immediate recovery. But all the UK government has committed to since then has been a loan guarantee of up to 300 million pounds.
Yeah.
So the BVI can find, if the BVI can borrow, the UK will guarantee honoring that loan up to 300 million pounds, which, like I said, if you have damage which is 4 billion, 300 million doesn't really go that far.
Yeah.
And then to compound things, in May, at the beginning of May, the UK Parliament passed a law that essentially targets our financial services industry, which I said earlier, essentially is 2/3 of our revenue. So the decision that they took, could really jeopardize the long-term viability of that industry here,
Mm.
especially. And, it doesn't really, I mean, I don't want to go too in depth in that because I'm not really an economist or a commercial lawyer. But essentially, if that law stands, I mean, one, it's sort of overriding our constitution. And then two, it could really be to the detriment of our main revenue.
Yeah.
So it makes our future coming out of the storm, that much more uncertain. So there was even a protest march about the UK's decision about 2 weeks ago, where people came out and thousands of people came out to protest the UK Parliament's decision. And it's just I think what would have to happen. I guess the next step for the overseas territories has to be some sort of lobbying for, I guess, like a new deal, a new constitutional arrangement where the UK will not be able to impose legislation so easily, or will not be able to suspend, duly elected governments so easily with impunity.
Yeah.
So that's why I envision being the conversation moving forward.
It's such a strange thing too to talk about when governments are talking about aid for natural disasters. Like, that is the kind of language that governments usually use when they're talking about foreign aid. But
Exactly.
like, certainly we've been talking about this a lot in the U.S. about aid to Puerto Rico in helping them recover from Irma. And again, like, a lot of people, even, lay people and government people, talk about it, and it makes it sound like we're sending, foreign aid to some foreign country, but these are American citizens.
Exactly.
And it's if it were in, like if there were a hurricane in Virginia or something, and,
Would you
Washington,
think
D.C. got devastated, you wouldn't talk about it that way.
exactly?
Yeah.
So it sort of makes you think, like, if you're Puerto Rican, if you are from the U.S., if you're a U.S. Virgin Islander, and the same way if you're a British Virgin Islander, you kind of wonder about, your citizenship. You are not quite afforded I mean, it's one thing to say that, I'm an American citizen, I'm a British citizen, if I'm not afforded the same rights and benefits of that citizenship,
Mm-hmm.
as others. So it makes you really question, as a BV Islander, what being British really means for me, or what being a British citizen, or what benefit is it for us to remain a British territory?
Yeah. It's something, that I was thinking about when I was reading your book, insofar as, so this book is, the collection is published by an English press, UK press. And as far as I'm aware, like, I'm American, so obviously I'm going to be more aware of what's happening here. But as far as I'm aware, the, English language poetry world tends to be, is sort of heavily focused on New York and I guess maybe London.
Mm-hmm.
And so it seems like, given the publishing and then how, who the audience is, especially for, sort of a small press poetry book, a lot of the people reading it are likely to be people who are not very aware of either the history or the present day politics or, current events of the Virgin Islands.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems very relevant also to how, just like we're saying that, like, the British government does not seem to be paying very much attention to the situation in the Virgin Islands, and is, the average British citizen probably doesn't spend a lot of time thinking about it either, which is it just must be such a strange thing. And I wondered how, with the book, that sort of lack of awareness seems to, on the one hand, motivate the book, but also, like, must affect how it's being received as well.
Well, I mean, it definitely, yeah, I guess you could say it's a motivation of mine. I mean, it's just easier having British citizenship to work with a British market, and also I have some history there. I mean, since I did both my master's and my PhD I did in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
So I have certain connections and relationships there already. And it also makes developing a relationship with other poets and with the publishing industry. I have an easier or a much more direct, a much more logical entry point in the British publishing world than I do the American.
Mm-hmm.
And also, since I write at least right now, my first two projects, and it seems I have a couple other projects I'm working on, and they're all concerned, in varying dimensions and varying degrees with the BVI and, its various histories and its various relationships with other places, including the UK. It just seems that the UK would be one of the more appropriate audiences for this work. And, to be frank, I mean, I haven't encountered a lot of negative reception, but I have gotten a lot of, like, when you read reviews, especially of my first book, there is a lot of, acknowledgement that these histories, these narratives, these relationships, these perspectives are new to a lot of my readers. Mm-hmm. I think that was definitely impetus for the writing, because most people are aware of the transatlantic slave trade, aware of slavery and the plantocracy and and to a lesser extent indentureship and all that stuff. And most people are aware, especially in the UK, of the histories and the literary traditions, especially of the larger English-speaking islands. The Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados, not an island, but Guyana. But the smaller islands, places with the smaller histories, the smaller populations, the smaller stories, tend to get lost. So like there's some metonymy that Jamaican history or Jamaican culture tends to assume for the entire region. So, in other words, like, a lot of people subconsciously feel that if they've read a Jamaican novel, or they've read a Jamaican poet, or not to pick on Jamaica, the same thing is true to a lesser extent about Trinidad and Barbados. Just in the sense that they've kind of dominated the literary landscape. And so therefore a lot of the stories, a lot of the narratives, a lot of the perspectives of the Caribbean that are resonating outside of it tend to be from those islands, with the one major exception probably being Walcott and St. Lucia. So, most people, haven't heard these narratives, haven't heard of these stories, these histories, these perspectives, or haven't seen this landscape in print. And so therefore there's a certain dimension of my reception, which has been that people have been learning about the BVI, outside of it, the two ways in which it is usually framed, which is either A, this tax haven, right? Or B, as sort of like this paradisal playground for the wealthy to vacation in.
Yeah.
So there's sort of like there's no in between. Like, these are the two ways in which a place like the Virgin Islands is formed in the mind in the West. So hopefully my book and other work that comes out of this region begins to create a more fully developed, more three-dimensional portrait of this place and its history.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there is one last question that I ask everyone, and that is, if there is a piece of art or literature or just general creativity that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
Recently that meant something to just one? Oof. That's a tough question, Mike. Just one. Well, okay, how about this? Can I cheat?
Sure.
Can I give you some visual art?
Yeah.
Some poetry and some fiction?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, good. And it's all going to be Caribbean based. So for about 5 years now, a friend of mine, David Knight Jr., who's from St. John in the U.S. Virgin Islands, he and I have been running a literary journal by the name of Moko Magazine, and that's MOKO Magazine. So we publish Caribbean literature and Caribbean art, and I've one of the painters that we featured, I don't know, maybe about 3 years ago, her work just always comes back to me. Her name is Shancy Miller, and she's from St. Thomas in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And she has these photorealistic, surrealistic portraits. She has this one that I keep returning to. It's actually featured on the website, and it's called The Gardener. And it's this barebacked Rasta, and he appears almost as sort of like a Christ figure. You know, so you think about those messianic portraits of Christ, you know, in the Renaissance, you know, with the halos and the gestural configurations of his hands and whatnot. And just imagine a Rasta man in the garden, you know, with those same sort of gestural homages to the Renaissance. And it's just it's an astounding work. And I've been trying to think, okay, maybe in a future collection of poems, I can kind of convince her to license me the artwork for a cover. But it's one of my favorite Caribbean paintings in recent memory. So that's visual art. With fiction, I highly recommend. I mean, I'm also working on a couple projects right now. I've just finished, I guess, what feels like the first draft of a manuscript for my third collection of poems. And I'm doing some nonfiction work, and I'm just playing around with the beginnings of a novel. So in that respect, I'm really a huge fan of Kai Miller's August Town. And Kai is a Jamaican poet, essayist, and writer. And August Town is his latest work. It's a novel set in Jamaica in about 2 or 3 different eras. And it's in the same place, clearly. August Town is a sort of like a suburb of Kingston. And it's just, I mean, it's really an incredible accomplishment, I think, in terms of these 3 portraits sort of kind of creating a picture of the place. It's inspirational to me in terms of as I try to dive headfirst into some fiction, which is sort of intimidating in a weird way. And then poetry, I would say there are lots of really special, really powerful Caribbean poets with first and second books. Many of whom I count my friends. And then there's a huge class of writers who haven't yet put out their first book that I'm really looking forward to. But I guess right now I would highly recommend Shivani Ramlochan. She's a friend of mine from Trinidad. And her first collection is called Everyone Knows That I Am a Haunting. And that's actually been shortlisted for the Forward Prize for Best First Collection, which is one of the major poetry prizes in the UK. And so I was lucky enough to have my first book on the list last year. And so it was something else to see one of your friends, you know, get on the same list the next year. So, I'm just glad that I didn't put my book out the same year. I'm glad I didn't put my first book out the same year she put her first book. Because maybe I wouldn't have been on the list last year. But yeah, Shivani's book is an accomplishment. And I think it's she's one of those voices that's going to be here to stay. And she has this unflinching way of just peeling back the layers and dimensions of her soul that are just, you know, arresting. I would highly recommend that book.
Great. Well, thank you so much for talking with me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mike. I really enjoyed talking to you today.
Okay, so if you enjoyed our conversation, do check out Richard's book, Giant, and there's a link in the show notes to where you can purchase a copy for yourself. There's also a link to the magazine you heard us talk about, Moko, so do check that out as well. And that is our show. If you'd like to get in touch, you can find all of the show's contact and social media info in the show notes. If you'd like to support the show, a monthly pledge in any amount to our Patreon campaign is greatly appreciated. You can find that at patreon.com/sakeriver. That's sake like the drink and river like river. Our theme music is by Poddington Bear. You can find more of his music available for licensing at soundofpicture.com. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new conversation, so be sure to come back for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.